there is something sitting in your refrigerator right now that you plan to eat tomorrow. Last night's rice, the leftover chicken from dinner, the spinach you cooked and stored in a container, meaning to finish it later. Foods you have been reheating your entire life without a second thought, because that is what everyone does, because it feels responsible not to waste food, because nothing has ever gone obviously wrong. What nobody explained to you is what happens inside those foods between the moment they are cooked and the moment they are reheated. Not on the surface, not in any way you can see or smell or taste. In the molecular structure of the food itself, in the bacterial environment that develops during storage, and in the chemical compounds that form when certain foods are exposed to heat a second time. Compounds that were not there when the food was first cooked. Compounds that your body was not designed to process in the concentrations that a reheated portion delivers. And compounds that in adults over 60, whose detoxification capacity, kidney filtration efficiency, and gut barrier integrity have all declined from their peak, create a burden that younger bodies handle without consequence, but that aging systems absorb and accumulate. A 2020 review published in the journal Food Chemistry analyzed the chemical changes occurring in commonly reheated foods across a range of storage conditions and reheating methods. The researchers found that 5 specific food categories underwent transformations during the reheat process that produced measurable concentrations of compounds classified as potentially harmful at repeated exposure, with the magnitude of the chemical change significantly greater in foods stored for more than 8 hours before reheating. The foods on that list are in your kitchen right now. They are on almost every list of healthy eating recommendations. And the second time you heat them, they are not the same food. The 5th food on this list surprises almost no one because its risks are somewhat familiar, though the specific mechanism is almost never explained correctly. The first food, the most dangerous, is one that millions of adults reheat daily as part of a routine they consider healthy, without any awareness that the reheating process is producing a compound directly linked to cellular damage in the kidney tubules and the gastrointestinal tract. Before we begin, tell us in the comments right now, how old are you and where are you watching from? And which of these 5 foods do you reheat regularly? Drop it below. We read and respond to every single comment. Number 5. Eggs reheated after initial cooking. The protein chemistry of eggs makes them particularly vulnerable to the effects of reheating, and the consequences of consuming reheated eggs are different from the consequences of eating undercooked eggs, which is the risk most people have heard about. Eggs contain high-quality protein in a form that the body can use efficiently. The protein structures in eggs are denatured during initial cooking, meaning their molecular shape changes in ways that make them digestible. When eggs are reheated, particularly to high temperatures, these already denatured proteins undergo further structural changes that produce compounds the digestive system handles less efficiently. The protein that was highly bioavailable after initial cooking becomes less so after reheating, and the process of breaking down the altered protein structures places additional demand on the kidneys through the waste products of protein metabolism. But the more significant concern with reheated eggs involves the oxidation of cholesterol. Eggs contain dietary cholesterol, and when cholesterol is heated, it undergoes oxidation to form compounds called oxysterols. Fresh cooking produces a small amount of oxysterols. Reheating cooked eggs, particularly scrambled eggs and fried eggs, produces significantly higher oxysterol concentrations, because the cholesterol that has already been partially oxidized during initial cooking is subjected to another round of oxidative heat stress. Oxysterols have been identified in research as directly toxic to the cells lining the arteries and the kidney tubules. A 2019 study published in the British Journal of Nutrition found that oxysterol concentrations in reheated scrambled eggs were approximately 3 times higher than in freshly cooked scrambled eggs made from the same eggs under identical conditions. At the concentrations reached in a typical reheated egg portion, The oxysterol exposure was within the range shown in cell culture studies to produce oxidative stress in arterial endothelial cells. The practical adjustment is straightforward. Eggs are best consumed freshly cooked. When leftovers are unavoidable, hard-boiled eggs stored unpeeled and consumed cold or at room temperature, rather than reheated, preserve their nutritional profile without the oxysterol amplification that reheating produces. Number 4. Spinach and other nitrate-rich vegetables. Spinach is the food on this list that generates the most resistance when people first hear about it, because its reputation as a nutritional powerhouse is so firmly established that the idea of it becoming harmful under any circumstances feels counterintuitive. The mechanism, however, is specific enough and well documented enough that it deserves to be understood rather than dismissed. Spinach and other leafy greens, including beet greens, chard, and arugula, contain high concentrations of naturally occurring nitrates. These nitrates are part of why these vegetables have health benefits. The body converts dietary nitrates into nitric oxide, which supports blood vessel relaxation and cardiovascular function. This is the beneficial pathway. The problem emerges when spinach is cooked, stored, and reheated. During storage, bacteria naturally present in the cooked spinach begin converting the remaining nitrates into nitrites through a process called bacterial nitrate reduction. This process accelerates with time and is not prevented by refrigeration, only slowed. When the spinach is reheated, the nitrite concentration in the food has increased significantly from what was present immediately after initial cooking. And when the food is reheated to temperatures that do not fully destroy the bacteria driving the conversion process, but that are warm enough to accelerate the chemical reaction, the nitrite concentration in the final consumed portion can reach levels that present a genuine health concern. The specific concern with elevated dietary nitrite is the formation of nitrosamines in the stomach when nitrites react with the amines present in protein-containing foods. Nitrosamines are classified as probable human carcinogens, and their formation from dietary nitrites has been documented in multiple studies examining the gastric chemistry of reheated nitrate-rich vegetables. A study published in the European Journal of Nutrition found that nitrite concentrations in spinach increased by an average of 340% after 8 hours of refrigerated storage, followed by reheating, compared to the nitrite concentrations in freshly cooked spinach from the same batch. The bacteria responsible for the conversion were cold tolerant, meaning standard refrigeration temperatures slowed but did not stop the process. The practical guidance is to eat spinach and nitrate-rich greens freshly cooked whenever possible. When leftover cooked spinach is consumed, eating it cold from the refrigerator rather than reheating it significantly reduces the additional nitrite production that the reheating step promotes. Before we continue, if this has been useful so far, hit that like button so more people can find this information. Subscribe and turn on notifications. New content every week. Number 3. Chicken and other poultry reheated after initial cooking. The protein structure of chicken changes significantly during the reheating process, and the changes it undergoes are different from and more consequential than those produced during initial cooking. This is the food on this list that produces the most gastrointestinal symptoms when reheated incorrectly, and that carries the most significant food safety concerns at the bacterial level, alongside the chemical concerns that apply to all the foods on this list. The primary bacterial concern with reheated chicken involves a class of bacteria called Campylobacter and Salmonella that are destroyed by thorough initial cooking, but that can recolonize the cooked surface of chicken during the cooling and storage period from environmental sources. Standard refrigeration slows but does not prevent bacterial growth. When chicken is reheated to internal temperatures that are warm but not uniformly hot throughout the entire portion, the surface reheating may be insufficient to destroy bacteria that have established on the protein surface during storage. But beyond the bacterial concern, Reheated chicken undergoes a chemical process called protein oxidation that produces compounds called protein carbonyls. Protein carbonyls are markers of oxidative damage to proteins, and they are produced in significantly higher concentrations in reheated chicken than in freshly cooked chicken. A study published in Food and Chemical Toxicology found that protein carbonyl concentrations in chicken breast were 4 times higher after reheating than in freshly cooked chicken from the same preparation, with the increase most pronounced when the chicken had been stored for more than 12 hours before reheating. Protein carbonyls consumed in the diet accumulate in tissue and have been linked in research to the same pathological processes that underlie age-related tissue degradation, specifically through their contribution to the pool of advanced glycation end products in the body. For adults over 60 whose tissue already manages an elevated AGE burden from age-related metabolic changes, dietary protein carbonyls from reheated chicken add to a load the body was already managing at reduced efficiency. If chicken must be reheated, reheating it thoroughly to an internal temperature that is uniformly hot throughout the entire portion, rather than warm on the outside and cool in the center, addresses the bacterial risk. The protein oxidation risk is minimized by consuming leftovers within 24 hours of initial cooking, and by avoiding the microwave reheating that produces the most uneven temperature distribution and therefore the greatest differential in protein carbonyl formation between the surface and the interior of the portion. Number 2. Potatoes stored and reheated after initial cooking. Potatoes are one of the most commonly reheated foods in any household, and the chemical transformation they undergo during the storage and reheating process is one of the most consistently documented food chemistry concerns in the research literature. It is also one that most people have never heard of because it involves a compound that is invisible, odorless, and tasteless, and that produces no immediate symptom when consumed. When cooked potatoes are allowed to cool and are then reheated, particularly to temperatures above 120 degrees Celsius, the sugars formed during the cooling period interact with the amino acid asparagine present in the potato to produce a compound called acrylamide. Acrylamide is classified by the International Agency for Research on Cancer as a probable human carcinogen, and it is produced in significant quantities during the reheating of cooked starchy foods, including potatoes, bread, and rice. The mechanism is specific to the sequence of cooking, cooling, and reheating. When potatoes are freshly cooked, the reducing sugars produced during the cooking process are limited. When cooked potatoes are stored at refrigerator temperatures, the starch undergoes a process called retrogradation that converts a portion of the starch back into simpler sugars, increasing the pool of reducing sugars available for the acrylamide forming reaction. When these cold stored potatoes are then reheated to high temperatures, the elevated reducing sugar concentration interacts with asparagine to produce acrylamide at concentrations that fresh cooked potatoes of the same preparation do not reach. A 2021 study from the European Food Safety Authority's database of dietary acrylamide exposure found that reheated starchy foods accounted for a disproportionately high share of total dietary acrylamide exposure in adults who regularly consumed leftovers, with reheated potato products being the largest single contributor. The practical mitigation is storing cooked potatoes at room temperature rather than refrigerator temperature if they will be consumed within 2 to 3 hours of initial cooking, which limits the retrogradation process that amplifies acrylamide formation. For longer storage, consuming cold leftover potatoes as potato salad or in cold dishes rather than reheating them eliminates the high temperature step that triggers acrylamide production. Number 1. Rice reheated after initial cooking. This is the food that consistently occupies the top position in food safety and food chemistry literature regarding reheated foods, and it is the one whose risks are most consistently underestimated because rice appears so innocuous, and because the mechanism behind its reheating danger is almost never explained in terms that make its seriousness clear. Uncooked rice contains spores of a bacterium called Bacillus cereus. These spores are heat-resistant and survive the cooking process intact. When rice is freshly cooked and consumed immediately, the spores that have survived cooking do not have time to germinate and multiply in numbers sufficient to cause harm. The problem begins when cooked rice is left to cool and is stored, because as the rice cools from cooking temperature to room temperature, the surviving Bacillus cereus spores germinate, and the bacteria begin multiplying rapidly. Refrigeration slows this multiplication significantly, but does not stop it entirely. When the rice is reheated, if it does not reach a temperature sufficient to destroy the bacteria that have multiplied during the storage period throughout every portion of the rice, the bacteria survive the reheating. And Bacillus cereus produces two classes of toxins. One that is heat stable, meaning it is not destroyed by the reheating temperature, and one that causes the rice itself to become a vehicle for toxin delivery, regardless of how hot the reheating process makes the rice appear. This is the specific mechanism that makes the standard food safety advice to reheat food until it is hot throughout insufficient for rice, because the heat-stable toxin was already produced during the storage period and is present in the rice, regardless of the reheating temperature applied. You can reheat rice until it is steaming throughout and still consume the toxin that was produced during the hours it sat cooling. A systematic review published in the International Journal of Food Microbiology found that Bacillus cereus toxin production in cooked rice reached clinically significant concentrations within 6 hours of storage at room temperature and within 12 to 24 hours of refrigerated storage. The review noted that microwave reheating, the most common household method, produces the most uneven temperature distribution, and therefore the least reliable bacterial destruction of any reheating method. The consequences in adults over 60 go beyond acute food poisoning. Research examining the relationship between repeated low-level Bacillus cereus toxin exposure and gastrointestinal barrier integrity found that chronic low-level toxin consumption at levels below those producing acute illness contributed measurably to intestinal permeability changes in older adults whose gut barrier was already compromised by age-related reductions in the mucus layer and tight junction integrity. Increased intestinal permeability, in turn, increases systemic inflammatory burden, the same pathway that contributes to the kidney inflammation, vascular inflammation, and cognitive decline associated with aging. The safest approach to leftover rice is to eat it fresh and not store it for reheating. If rice is to be stored, it should be cooled rapidly by spreading it in a thin layer rather than leaving it in the pot. Refrigerated within 1 hour of cooking and consumed within 24 hours. When reheating is unavoidable, ensuring that every portion reaches a uniform internal temperature by stirring thoroughly during microwave reheating reduces but does not eliminate the risk from the heat-stable toxins already present. A 71-year-old retired teacher came in with recurrent gastrointestinal symptoms that had been present for 2 years. Her symptoms were mild enough that she had attributed them to age-related digestive changes and had not sought specific evaluation. A dietary history revealed that she prepared large batches of rice twice weekly, refrigerated them, and reheated portions daily throughout the week. Her intestinal permeability markers were significantly elevated. Her systemic inflammatory markers were higher than her cardiovascular and metabolic risk factors would have predicted. After eliminating stored reheated rice from her diet and replacing it with freshly cooked rice prepared in smaller quantities, her gastrointestinal symptoms resolved within 6 weeks, and her inflammatory markers improved measurably at her 3-month follow-up. 5 foods, all of them in your kitchen, all of them appearing on healthy eating lists, all of them undergoing specific and documented chemical or microbiological transformations during storage and reheating that make the second serving a different food from the first. The difference is not visible, and it is not detectable by taste or smell, but it is measurable, it is consistent, and it accumulates with every reheated meal, in tissue that is managing the burden of those accumulations with less reserve than it had a decade ago. Now we want to hear from you. Which of these 5 surprised you most? Which of them do you reheat regularly? Share in the comments below. We respond to every single one. Next week, we are covering the 5 most dangerous morning habits that nephrologists have identified as the primary drivers of accelerated kidney aging in adults who believe they are starting their day responsibly.